Hello everybody. Welcome back to the video series Creating the Basic Adaptable Game Engine Library. This is part 1, the core classes. In the previous video, we talked about what the Bagel project is all about. And we also discussed that in the first third of these videos, we'll be creating a very simple game. That game I like to call Starfish Collector. I consider this to be the hello world of video games. Hello world is a tradition in computer science. When learning a new language, one of the first programs you typically write is one that prints the words hello world to the screen. In terms of a first game development project, we want to create a very simple game. And I would argue that the most simple game you could create would be a collection style game. In this game, there's a background image, and you control this turtle character with the arrow keys. The goal is to move the character until it touches the starfish, in which case you have collected the starfish and won the game. It might not be the world's most exciting game, but it does introduce us to some of the core things we need in creating a game. Creating a window, drawing graphics, controlling characters, and topics like that. Now, in order to create this game, we need some core classes. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what these classes will be. We'll start with the most complex class, and then maybe go down to the simpler classes. The first class that one might think of, I'll call the base class. The base class creates the window in which the game is played, and it runs a game loop, which we'll talk about more in a future video, that basically updates the input and it'll draw the graphics 60 times per second. And this includes core functionality common for all games. We'll think of it as an abstract class, and the base class will be extended for the actual games we create. Now, any game should be interactive, and all the interactivity will be handled by a class named input. In particular, we're going to focus on keyboard input in these games. Within the game window, we'll have a lot of different images which represent our game entities. And that will be handled by a class named Sprite. The Sprite class will represent each object, whether it moves, whether it's a background image, whether it's an object that we collect. Those will all be considered as sprites. The group class will handle collections of these game entities, right? In this first example, we have one example of a background, one player character controlled, and one object to collect. But in more advanced versions of this game, you might imagine that there's, for example, lots of starfish to collect. And so I'd like to create a group class which can be used to manage a collection of sprite objects. Now, in particular, we have sprites and we have groups, and they actually do have some properties in common. And we'll create a class named Entity to abstract those common properties between sprite and group. So Entity will be a superclass, and sprite and group will be extensions of that entity class. For example, our game consists of a collection of sprites and groups, and those groups might also contain particular types of sprites. And so we'll want to draw the group of all sprites in that game, and that might include some subgroups which refer to types of objects. Those will be called entities. Each sprite will be responsible for managing different types of information. For example, each sprite has a position on the screen with an X and a Y coordinate. And there will be things we need to do to those X and Y coordinates. We might need to add or subtract values from them. It'll be most useful to package that information into a single class, and we'll be able to add some functionality to it as well. We'll have a lot to say about the vector class later on. Rectangles will be used to model the boundaries of each of these objects. Rectangles will handle the collisions between different objects, which are useful for when the turtle, say, collects a starfish, or when we simulate solid objects later on. We'll model each object as a rectangular shape, and that'll be handled by a rectangle class. And finally, we're going to need to store image data for each of these sprites, and we'll handle that with a class called texture, which will not only store an image, but it'll also tell us which part of the image is being rendered in this sprite. And at first it might seem a little bit abstract, but it'll become really useful to have a separate class to store image data when we want to do advanced image effects later on, such as animations. So to create the Starfish Collector game, these are the different classes we're going to need. We'll first start off by implementing the vector class. It's kind of the simplest class. Then we'll discuss the rectangle class and then the texture class. And once we have these three, then we can move on to sprites, groups, and entities. And then we'll create the base and input classes. So that's the plan for the first third of this set of videos. And then we'll have our simple game, Starfish Collector, up and running as soon as possible. Thanks for watching.